Modern rulers of Iran will often claim to be the continuation of a culture and civilizations going back to the Iron Age, but the truth is much more complicated. Southwestern Iran was part of the Fertile Crescent, with the city of Susa showing settlement back to around 4200 BC. Artifacts from the Kura Araxes culture in what is now northeastern Iran have been found going back to around 3400 BC. Greek historian Herodotus indicated that sometime during the 7th century BC, much of modern day Iran was under a single group known as the Median Kingdom. He said, quote, "The Medes were formerly called by everyone Aryans, but then when the Colchian woman Medea came from Athens to the Aryans, they changed their name, like the Persians did after Perses, son of Perses and Andromeda. This is the Medes' only account of themselves." If there truly was a Median dynasty is still debated, as there are contradictions in the historical accounts, but most agree that sometime around 553 BC, a vassal of a Median king by the name of Cyrus led an uprising, creating what is now known as the Persian Empire, becoming known as Cyrus the Great. The Persians under Cyrus conquered not only most of what is modern day Iran, but also much of modern day Turkey and huge portions of the Middle East. Cyrus's son Cambyses II was able to capture Egypt, effectively ending the 26th dynasty of Egypt. What happened next is much disputed because of conflicting accounts. The account of the person who would emerge as the new ruler of the empire, Darius, was that Cambyses lost his mind, murdered his brother, and then died of an infected leg, leading a usurper to take the throne. Other accounts seem to indicate Darius initiated the coup, and that he murdered the rightful successor, Cambyses' brother. Regardless, Darius did emerge in control of the empire after a series of civil wars, and wrote his dubious account of the history in the Behistun inscription. Once Darius had re-established control over the areas in rebellion, he began expanding the Persian Empire, going as far as modern-day Pakistan in the east and invading Greece in the northwest. Greek forces were able to stop the invasion at the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC, but the Greek city-states and the Persians would be at war for around 50 years, with Persia forcing large portions of Macedon into vassalage at various times, before being pushed out into peace reached in 449 BC. Persia occupied Egypt also went into revolt and was able to push out rulers for over 50 years from 404 BC to 343 BC before being reconquered by Artaxerxes III. Starting around 334 BC, out of the previously vassalized region of Macedon, Alexander the Great's forces emerged and conquered much of the Persian Empire. While his conquests did expand beyond existing Persian holdings farther into Egypt and Central Asia, the vast majority of the land his armies conquered was already under Persian rule. When Alexander died at the age of 32, the newly conquered empire soon collapsed into civil war among his generals, eventually breaking into three groups: Ptolemaic Egypt, Seleucid Syria, and Antigonid Macedonia. Most of modern-day Iran fell into the Seleucid partition, named after Alexander's general Seleucus. The Greek historian Appian said of Seleucus, quote, "Always lying in wait for the neighboring nations, strong in arms and persuasive in council, he acquired Mesopotamia, Armenia, Seleucid Cappadocia, Perseus, Parthia, Bactria, Arabia, Taporia, Sogdia, Arachosia, Hyrcania, and other adjacent peoples that had been subjugated by Alexander, as far as the river Indus, so that the boundaries of the empire were the most extensive in Asia after that of Alexander. The whole region from Phrygia to Indus was subject to Seleucus." Over time, the Seleucian Empire lost land in what is now modern-day India, but were able to expand west back to the edge of the Roman Empire. This led to a series of conflicts known as the Roman-Seleucid War, which started around 192 BC, and this war went poorly for the Seleucid. The peace treaty from this conflict required indemnity payments, which severely weakened the empire, and soon after, civil war broke out across the empire, often egged on by their Roman rivals. This allowed the Parthian Empire, which had already broken off from the Seleucid over 100 years prior, to be able to push the Seleucid out of what is now Iran during the Parthian-Seleucid Wars. By around 148 BC, the Parthians were in control of Babylonia and Mesopotamia, functionally bringing to the end the Seleucid dynasty. But this also meant now the Parthians were in contact and often conflict with Rome over the next several hundred years. Parthian relations with their eastern neighbors were generally more based around trade than war. Control of the paths along the so-called Silk Road between Europe and China allowed Parthian rulers to become wealthy by taxing the caravans going back and forth. After a remarkable 5 centuries of rule, two brothers found themselves squabbling over who would take control of the empire next. While the squabble between the two brothers weakened the empire, a vassal ruler by the name of Ardashir was consolidating power in southern Iran. Reportedly, Ardashir's older brother, Shapur, had been selected to rule, but Ardashir rejected the claim and attempted to take power. When Shapur died, reportedly after a roof collapsed on him, his other brothers contested Ardashir taking power. but Ardashir had them put to death. Ardashir moved the capital of his region to a more defensible location and raised forces to lead against the weakened Parthians. The king of Parthia was killed during the battle. The specifics of the history of this transition are disputed, in part because of Ardashir's attempt to build a mythology around himself which could connect him to ancient Persian rulers. But most agree after the victory, Ardashir was not only able to take control of the empire, but expand it. He declared himself the Shahanshah, or King of Kings. This was the start of the Sassanid Empire, which expanded to the east and northwest, and continued the ongoing rivalry with the Romans. At its height, the Sassanid Empire included not only all of modern-day Iran, but also Iraq, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, Dagestan, Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine, and Israel, and it also expanded into parts of modern-day Afghanistan, Turkey, Syria, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. But this was at its height, with control over these areas often contested, particularly by the Roman Empire and its later continuance under the Byzantine Empire. Most people of the region practiced a variation of Zoroastrianism. By the time of the Sassanid Empire, the religion had fragmented into many local variations with local cult deities. Ardashir's son Shapur was not only tolerant of other religions, but encouraged variety. An Iranian man by the name of Mani, whose parents belonged to a religious sect informed both by Jewish and early Christian teachings, was proclaimed a prophet and founded the Manichaeism religion. This religion for a time was one of the most widespread religions in the world, having followers found in China and all the way out to the British Isles. Catholic St. Augustine was reportedly a follower of the Manichaean religion prior to his conversion to Christianity in 387 AD. His conversion came roughly 4 years after the Roman Emperor passed laws against Manichaeism in 382 AD. But Shapur's religiously tolerant rule was more an exception. After initially being supported in his missionary trips, Mani eventually ran afoul of Zoroastrian clerics and found himself imprisoned. He died while awaiting an execution order by Shapur's son, Bahram. The various conflicts between the Romans and then Byzantine empires went back and forth for centuries. The ongoing conflicts between the Byzantines and the Sassanid not only weakened the empires themselves, but also led to the spread of diseases. The most famous example was likely the Plague of Shiro, which by some reports killed as many as 100,000 people in the Sassanid capital between 627 and 628 AD. Eventually, the armies of the two empires were both so weakened that a new movement was able to consolidate in Arabia, led by Muhammad, the founder of the Islamic religion. Islamic tradition holds that Muhammad wrote a letter to the Shah in 628 inviting him to convert to Islam. The letter reportedly said, quote, "In the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful, from Muhammad, the Messenger of Allah, to Kisra, the great leader of the Persians. Peace be upon him who seeks truth and expresses belief in Allah and in his Prophet, and testifies there is no God but Allah, and that he has no partner, who believes that Muhammad is his servant and prophet. Under the command of Allah, I invite you to him. He has sent me for the guidance of all people, that I may warn you of his wrath and may present unbelievers with an ultimatum. Embrace Islam so you may remain safe, and if you refuse to accept Islam, you will be responsible for the sins of the Magi." The tradition goes on to claim that upon reading the letter, the Shah said, quote, "A pitiful slave among my subjects dares write his name before mine," and sent for Muhammad to be brought to him. However, soon after, the Shah would be murdered in a coup orchestrated by his son, Shiro, who took the throne shortly after executing his father and most of his family. Shiro gave himself the dynastic name Qajar II, shortly before he himself died of the plague that was ravaging the city, and which we remembered by his name. In the civil war that followed, many made claims to the throne, eventually resulting in an 8-year-old grandson of the former ruler becoming Shah around 632. While this was taking place, Muhammad and his forces were taking advantage of the instability and had built a powerful army that had expanded into former Byzantine and Sassanid-controlled areas of the Middle East. But Muhammad himself died in 632, leading to the early caliphate having its own succession crisis and a brief civil war. Abu Bakr was selected to lead as caliph, but had to fight internal civil wars to maintain the title for nearly a year. Afterwards, he led an Arab army into Mesopotamia in 633, conquering much of what is now modern-day Iraq, before having to pull back forces and to send aid to forces fighting the Byzantine forces in Syria. When Abu Bakr became ill in 634, he sought to avoid a succession crisis similar to what happened when Muhammad died. He selected one of Muhammad's father-in-laws, Omar ibn al-Khattab, as his successor in his will. The Sassanids were able to briefly gain back some land, but over the next decade, Omar was able to lead the caliphate forces in conquest over what is much of now modern Iran, for he was assassinated by an Iranian prisoner of war and slave in 644. One of Muhammad's son-in-laws, Uthman ibn Affan, was chosen successor over another son-in-law and cousin, Ali ibn Ali Talib. While this didn't lead to an immediate civil war, it did provoke a great deal of controversy. Uthman was able to continue expanding the empire, conquering southwestern Iran and expanding to take control of Byzantine holdings in North Africa and Anatolia. But conquest didn't mean stability. Many resented Uthman's tendency to select rulers based on familial ties. An uprising broke out in Egypt, including a coup by fellow Muslims. Uthman found himself surrounded by opposition in his home in Medina. On June 17, 656, rebels were able to enter his home and assassinate him. Ali then became the fourth caliph, somewhat controversially because of the support he had from the same groups which assassinated Uthman. Ali moved the capital to what is now modern-day Iraq and found himself forced into a conflict against various rebel factions, losing control over large segments of the empire as it fell into civil war. As Ali's forces grew weaker, a former official of Mohammad, who had become a governor of Syria under Abu Bakr by the name of Muawiyah, was able to rally forces behind him around the cause of avenging the assassination of Uthman. Ali himself was assassinated in 661. His son Hassan was briefly named the caliph, but was forced to abdicate. Muawiyah was able to consolidate power and declared himself the next caliph, reportedly taking an oath in the holy city of Jerusalem. This functionally ended the Rashidun Caliphate and began the Umayyad Caliphate. The capital was moved to Damascus, which made Syria the center of the Islamic world. Portions of what is now modern-day Iran were able to resist conquest, thanks in large part to geographic advantages for defense, but most of Iran was under the new caliphate's rule. However, Arab rule did not prevent Persian cultural influence on the new caliphate. Many of the Arab provincial governors were Persian, or of groups with heavy connections to Persian culture, and as a result, many of the administrative processes remained in place. Middle Persian remained regularly used as a business language, at least initially, and while the coins were now minted in Damascus, they were more or less replicas of the Sasanian and Byzantine coins which preceded them, with Farsi replaced by Arabic. Muslims were favored by law, as non-Muslims had to pay a separate tax. Still, Zoroastrianism continued to exist in many parts of Iran, with fire temples being seen in Iraq, Fars, Kirman, Sistan, Khorasan, Tashrazan, Jilbat, Azerbaijan, and Iran. Starting around 743, the Umayyad Caliphate began to collapse into civil war. The Abbasid Caliphate that followed moved the capital to modern Iraq, building what is now modern-day Baghdad. The Abbasid reconquered parts of Iran that had seceded during the civil war, but they allowed more Persian culture in order to keep popular support in the region. Over time, the caliph took on a more ceremonial role, so that by the 10th century, there was significant local autonomy. The Khurramites were a local group who were influenced by Zoroastrianism and other earlier Iranian traditions. They were led by a man by the name of Babak Khuraddin. His forces were able to retake significant land from the Abbasid during a 20-year period in the early 800s, including taking and holding a fort that came to be known as Babak Castle. When Babak was eventually forced to leave the castle, a message was sent to him offering safe passage to meet to negotiate a surrender. Reportedly, Babak responded, quote, "Better to live for just a single day as a ruler than live for 40 years as an abject slave." Eventually, Babak was betrayed while hiding in the Byzantine Empire. He was turned over to the Abbasid, where reportedly his legs were cut off, then his hands, before he was gibbeted alive. The percentage of Muslims living in Iran grew from a narrow minority in the early 9th century to an overwhelming majority by the end of the 11th century. It was also during this time that a series of Iranian Islamic empires began to push out Arab rule and restore the primacy of the Persian culture and language, while still maintaining the Islamic religious influences. It was also during this time there was a revival of pride in Persian cultural history and language, including the writing of the Khamenei, an epic poem mixing myth and the history of the Persian people. This period is at times referred to as an Islamic Golden Age, as the introduction of paper from China, along with expanded writing systems, allowed more opportunities for learning. Islamic teachings emphasized education, with religious texts stating, quote, "Seeking knowledge is obligatory upon every Muslim." During this period, a large number of medical and philosophical texts, which would become highly influential, were written. The most famous example is likely the Compendious Book on Calculation by Completion and Balancing. This book was a compilation of rules for solving quadratic equations, and its shortened name, Aljabar, is how the term algebra was derived. A Latinized pronunciation of the author's name, Al-Warhazi, is also the basis for the word algorithm. The translation of this book is arguably one of the main reasons Hindu-Arabic numeral system is the worldwide standard today. Starting around 977, a Turkic group based in what is now modern-day Afghanistan established the Ghaznavid dynasty. Over time, they were able to expand and control what is now eastern Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and parts of northwest India. Around 1040, The Seljuk Turks had defeated the Ghaznavid to establish an empire which was so large it touched the Mediterranean Sea, the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, the Persian Gulf, and the Himalayas over the course of the 11th century. Starting around 1170, a Mamluk Turkish ruler was able to invade and create the Khurramites Empire, but it wouldn't last for long. Around 1218, Genghis Khan sent a large caravan of Mongol merchants to Khorasmia. This caravan was attacked and the goods seized. The Mongol Khan then sent diplomatic missionaries to seek reparations. The Khorasmians not only refused, but killed the diplomats. In response, in 1219, the Mongols invaded. Unlike all of the invaders who came before, the Mongols did not simply seek to change the ruler of the territory, but to instill fear and destroy any and all opposition. In just a few years, the Mongols had taken total control of the empire. The Mongols leveled cities, burned libraries, possibly deploying Chinese gunpowder weapons which had never been before used in the region. The violent nature of the attacks destroyed centuries of infrastructure and scholarship in the process. When Genghis died, his various territories were divided. One of his grandsons created the Khanate over what is much of Iran for the next 80 years. During this time, many of the Mongol invaders adopted both Persian and Islamic influences. By 1335, the Khanate was collapsing into civil war, and soon after, the Black Death was ravaging the entire subcontinent. Estimates are that as much as 30% of the population died of the disease. Around 1381, a Turco-Mongol leader by the name of Timur, also known as Tamerlane, led forces into the region, expanding what would be known as the Timurid Empire, and taking control of most of what is modern-day Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan, while also holding parts of Pakistan, Turkey, and even some parts of northern India. Tamerlane was inspired by Genghis Khan and saw himself as a successor to the Mongol rule. While his forces could be equally brutal and destructive in battle toward anyone who did not accept surrender, unlike the Mongols, he was interested in building trade and infrastructure within the empire as part of establishing a legacy for himself. He commissioned a biography to be written in the Persian language, and his court paid poets and artists, including commissioning a new edition of the Shahnameh. At its height, the Timurid Empire was arguably one of the most powerful empires in the entire world, rivaling even the Ming dynasty. But when Tamerlane died in 1405, civil wars followed. For a time, his son was able to bring the empire back together and expand even more into what is modern-day Iran. But by the end of the 15th century, they had lost control of most of Iran, and the seat of power shifted toward Afghanistan, where a descendant would establish the Mughal Empire. Around 1500, a leader of the Safavid Sufi order by the name of Ismail invaded a neighboring kingdom to avenge the murder of his father, which had occurred over a decade prior. He continued his military campaign across what is now Azerbaijan, and after capturing Tabriz, declared himself Shah of Shahs over all of Iran. His coins proclaimed Twelver Shi'ism as the official religion of Iran. This variant teaches that 12 Imam who descended from Muhammad, starting with Ali, were divinely appointed. The 12th Imam, known as the Mahdi, has already been born, but is currently concealed, or in occultation. The followers believe he will re-emerge to establish justice and peace on earth at the end of time. Sunni also generally believe such a figure will eventually emerge, but do not believe the Mahdi has already been born. The majority of Muslims today subscribe to the Sunni teachings, which tend to believe Muhammad did not name a specific successor. They therefore believe the selection of the community of Abu Bakr was appropriate. Shia Muslims tend to believe Muhammad had designated Ali to succeed him. The Safavid rulers, specifically Ismail, took a very strong position on this matter. They ordered all mosques to use the Shia call to prayer, which included, "I witness that Ali is God's friend," and said that whoever disobeys should be beheaded. And these were not just words. Reportedly, there were mass killings of Sunni elite and clergy in the city of Tabriz, including Sunni judges. The violence against those who refused to embrace the Shia teachings continued as their empire expanded. As they expanded into what is modern-day Iraq, they destroyed Sunni sites in Baghdad, including the tombs of the Abbasid caliphs. The Safavid were able to conquer much of modern-day Iran and Iraq before having their expansion limited to the west by the Ottoman Empire and to the east by the Mughals, predominantly Sunni Muslim empires. Ismail's son further expanded Shia clerical power in the government, creating what was for all intents and purposes a theocracy, with the Shah being a near-religious figure placed by God. The Safavid Empire at its largest controlled all of modern-day Iran, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Iraq, Afghanistan, most of Georgia, as well as parts of other neighboring areas. In 1587, at just 16 years old, Abbas, who would later become known as Abbas the Great, became Shah. During his reign, he built trade connections with Europe through the various East India companies along the Silk Road. He used his funds to modernize the Iranian military and allowed him to greatly expand the empire to the north and west. Having external sources of wealth also allowed him to centralize control over the empire, which was previously often dependent on alliances with local tribal groups, asking them to provide military support. But those that followed him weren't as successful. Although the Shah was often revered as being placed by God, that didn't mean the rulers fully abided by the laws of Islam. Reportedly, many of them had lavish parties, and heavy drinking was common, often to the detriment of the governance of the state. European trading companies were also increasingly more able to bypass the Silk Road, reducing income and leading to incursions from all sides. The empire began to shrink, both in power and size. By the late 1600s, the empire was falling into decline, and by the early 1700s was a shadow of its former greatness. Ottoman forces were able to retake much of what is now modern Iraq, and a Pashtun Afghan force from the east was able to reach the capital and capture and eventually behead the Shah. Amongst the chaos, a man named Nader was able to rise to power. Reports of his early life are disputed, but most agree he grew up in poverty, with his father dying when he was just 13 years old. Some accounts claim Nader and his mother were forced into slavery by Uzbek raiders when he was just 17 years old. But regardless of the truth, he was able to rise to become a local warlord, whose army grew to the point that he was able to reclaim much of the former Iranian territories. As he began to conquer the land he had come from, he reportedly said to his generals, quote, "You now see to what a height it has pleased the Almighty to exalt me. From this you should learn not to despise men of low estate." Initially, Nadar used his power to aid the restoration of the Safavid Shah to power in 1929, while operating as the true power behind the throne. By 1738, he removed all pretense and installed himself. By 1939, he had turned his attention toward expanding even further by taking the lands of the Mughal Empire in the east, reaching all the way to India and sacking Delhi. But over time, guerrilla forces forced him to withdraw from some of his territories in Dagestan. Reportedly, he became increasingly paranoid. After one assassination attempt, he accused his son of being involved and ordered his son to be blinded, with his eyes brought to him on a platter. In 1747, Nader was assassinated in his sleep by his guards. His nephew took power next, was deposed less than a year later, and the empire more or less collapsed into separate local rule. A group from western Iran, likely Kurdish, known as the Zand, took control of the largest section in what is now modern-day Iran. The leader of the Zand dynasty, Karim Khan, ruled in relative peace from 1751 until his death in 1779, but his death ended even that localized stability. A leader of the Qajar tribe, named Aga Muhammad Khan, rose to power taking control of northern Iran by 1786 and declaring himself ruler of Iran in 1789. He made Tehran the new capital. He was able to reclaim lands and reunify much of Iran, expanding his empire to include parts of modern-day Georgia and Azerbaijan. Aga had been castrated as a small child while being held captive by the nephew of Nadar, and was reportedly mistaken for a young boy when seen at a distance. Because he had been castrated, he had no children to be heirs, and named his nephew to succeed him. What he lacked in stature, he reportedly made up for in brutality. When his forces captured the territory of Khorasan, which was controlled at the time by Nader Shah's grandson, he had Nader Shah's body exhumed and sent to Tehran. He then demanded all of Nader Shah's treasure be given to him. When his grandson said he didn't know of any treasure, he was tortured until the location was revealed, at one point having molten lead poured on his head. Aga was reported as saying, "I have shed all of this blood, that the boy, Baba Khan, may reign in peace." Aga was officially crowned Shah of Iran in 1796, but was assassinated the following year by two of his servants. His wish for peace for his nephew did not come to pass. Over the coming decades, after a series of wars, Russia reconquered much of Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. As a result, many Muslims of the Caucasus began to migrate into Iran, as their lands were targeted for ethnic cleansing. Likely the most noticeable of the events was the Circassian genocide, in which between 1 million and 1.5 million were killed or displaced, effectively 95% of the pre-genocide population. Russia wasn't the only great power influencing Iran. Great Britain declared war against Iran in 1856 over territory around the city of Herat. These wars severely weakened Iran's government, forcing it to capitulate to Russia and Britain on many issues. Russian influence over Iranian politics was so strong that Russian officers were often deeply embedded in the Iranian military, most notably as part of the Iranian Cossack Brigade. Iran was working to grow and industrialize during this time, but as it did, much of the wealth went directly to the Shah rather than benefiting the people of Iran. In 1872, Nasser al-Din Shah was willing to give a contract which would give the British control over the Iranian roads, mills, factories, telegraphs, and the extraction of raw materials in exchange for the British getting 60% of the revenue. While this specific contract was stopped due to opposition within Iran, the British still owned the Imperial Bank of Persia. This functionally gave them a monopoly over all financial services in the country. In March of 1890, Nasser al-Din Shah gave a British baron a 50-year monopoly over the distribution and export of tobacco for just £25,000, 15,000 of which the Shah would keep personally. This led to massive protests, including a religious leader issuing a fatwa in which he declared tobacco use was akin to an act of war against the 12th Shia Imam. The boycott and protests were successful, and the contract was cancelled in 1892. Just a few years later, in 1896, the Shah was assassinated, leaving behind a financial mess. His successor continued to sign unfavorable and unpopular concession contracts with foreign powers to deal with the financial situation he'd been left, as well as new debts he was generating to support his lavish lifestyle. This included taking a 22 million ruble loan from Russia to fund a royal tour of Europe. All of this led to growing calls for restrictions on royal authority, which would reach a breaking point in 1905 when tariffs were imposed to repay Russian debt. Once again, religious leaders were deeply involved in the protest, particularly when a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad was killed by government officials breaking up a protest in 1906. That same year, the Shah was forced to yield some of his powers as a parliament was created as part of a new Persian constitution. But when the Shah died in January of the following year, his son took power with the British support opposing the new constitution. And that August, the British and Russians signed the Anglo-Russian Convention, functionally dividing the country into two spheres of influence. With the help of Russian forces, the Shah bombarded the Iranian parliament, and the civil war broke out. While Shia clerics had been instrumental in the protests against the Shah that brought the parliament, a prominent Shia cleric named Fazullah Nouri switched sides to support the Shah, declaring the new government was incompatible with Islamic law. Over the next year, constitutional forces were able to take back the capital as unrest grew and foreign loan support for troops dried up as victory seemed less and less likely for the Shah. The Shah was able to flee to Odessa, while Nouri stayed behind and was executed by the constitutional forces. 2 years later, in 1911, Russia demanded payment of the debts, but the parliament refused. Russian troops, many of whom were already stationed in Iran due to prior agreements, advanced on the capital, forcing the assembly to be dissolved and the state to give in to Russian demands. Although the British were coordinating with the Russians as they executed revolutionary leaders, British Ambassador George Head Barclay described what the Russians did as a reign of terror. The Russians functionally had control over northern Iran by 1914 and restored the Shah to power. In the south, the British worked around the zones of influence, built around deals with local warlords. But all of this international influence set the stage for the whole region to become a pivotal war zone in World War I, despite the Iranian government wishing for neutrality. The Ottoman Empire invaded in 1914, clashing with the Russian forces that were already present. In 1917, the Russian Revolution led to the withdrawal of many Russian forces from the region, allowing the Ottomans to occupy much of the country. During this time, Ottoman forces projected their genocidal policy of mass execution of ethnic Armenians and Assyrians in the areas they occupied. From 1917 to 1919, massive famine and outbreaks of related diseases led to the death of an estimated 2 million people as war disrupted crops and trade. By 1919, Iran was functionally a failed state. In 1920, a group known as the Persian Socialist Soviet Republic had taken control of a small region with the support of the Russian Red Army. They were preparing to march on Tehran to depose the Shah. Having few other options, the Shah called for the support of the Iranian Cossack Brigade, which was one of the few military forces he believed was available to him. But they were not loyal to the Shah. The Cossack force had been founded on the idea that Russian officers would be leading Iranians, but by this point, the British heavily influenced the group, and they often selected the officer corps. A man named Reza had been a member of the Cossack Brigade since he was 16 years old, and was one of the few Persian officers who had reached the level of brigadier general. By this time, the oil wealth of Iran was well known, and the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which would later become part of British Petroleum, had a clear interest in preventing the country from falling under a government which actively advocated for the nationalization of the oil industry. Brigadier General William Ironside allowed Reza to use his forces not to protect the Shah, but to seize the capital from the Shah in a coup in 1921. Reza then ruled as a military strongman for several years, brutally repressing opposition groups and removing the Qajar rulers, before naming himself the new Shah, changing his name to Reza Shah Pahlavi, starting the Pahlavi dynasty. It was during this time that Iran began to ask the international community to refer to it as Iran, which translates to the land of the Aryans, rather than Persia, although he believed both could be used interchangeably. Reza also negotiated treaties of friendship with the new Soviet government in 1921. The leadership of Russia was eager to have a new Iranian government to help them neutralize forces opposed to the Bolshevik Revolution, who had fled to Iran to regroup. The Shahs of Iran had been hoarding massive amounts of wealth for generations, and Reza began to use that money to fund massive modernization reforms, building railroads, highways, and a compulsory educational system. He also established a 100,000-man standing army so that he wouldn't be dependent as the Shah was. But he found himself in conflict with the clergy, as one of the mechanisms used to pay for these reforms was confiscating land and real estate from Islamic shrine endowments. He also confiscated some religious schools, including Jewish and Christian schools, converting them to secular learning centers. Sometime around 1928, his forces reportedly entered a sacred space to assault a cleric who had criticized his wife for briefly exposing her face while on a pilgrimage. Later that same year, he passed a law requiring most people to wear Western attire. These acts would often lead to protests. One notable protest took place at the Imam Reza shrine and lasted for 4 days as local police refused to enter the shrine, which was considered sacred. Protesters outside chanted, "The Shah is a new Yazid," referring to the second caliph, which Shia believed was appointed against the will of Muhammad. Perhaps in response, in 1936, the government banned women from wearing the hijab in public, with police at times physically removing the coverings from those who refused to comply. But although Reza sought to implement Western reforms, he was not entirely a puppet of the West. In 1932, he unilaterally canceled an oil agreement with the British, which only granted around 16% of the profits, forcing the British to negotiate more favorable terms. He also shifted the right to print money away from the British Imperial Bank to the National Bank of Iran and took back control of the telegraph systems. This tension with the British led to an overall decline in trade between the countries. In the lead up to World War II, Germany had actually become Iran's largest trading partner, with the Germans going so far as to declare Iranians were exempt from racial Nuremberg laws as they were, quote, pure Aryans. As a gift, Hitler provided Iran what he called the German Scientific Library, which consisted of around 7,500 books on eugenics, quote, to convince the Persians of the kinship between the Germans and the Persians, the modern Aryans and the ancient Aryans. Despite these connections, Iran tried to stay neutral when World War II began. Because of their strategic importance to the Germans and potential utility for the Russians, Allied Russian and British forces invaded and occupied the country in August of 1941, just 2 months after Hitler invaded Russia, breaking his agreement with Stalin. Reza Shah was forced to abdicate the throne to his son, Mohammad Reza Shah, who was only 22 years old at the time. As World War II came to an end and Allied forces withdrew from Iran, the new Shah initially was inclined to allow Parliament to take the lead in governance, with mixed results. From 1947 to 1951, Iran had 6 different prime ministers as a result of political instability. In 1949, Mohammad Reza was the victim of an assassination attempt, during which he was shot twice by someone suspected to be connected to an Islamic fundamentalist group. Following this, he banned a party that was rumored to have connections to the assassins and sent Ayatollah Abul Qasim Kashani into exile in Lebanon. The Shah now sought to increase his influence. He implemented a provision in the 1906 constitution which allowed for the creation of an upper house of parliament, which became the Senate of Iran, and this house tended to be more supportive of his policies. An opposition party known as the National Front began to emerge after a series of protests against corruption. In 1951, Prime Minister Haj Ali Rosmara was assassinated. Rosmara had opposed oil nationalization. The leader of the National Front, Mohammad Mossadegh, was selected as Prime Minister of Iran by the parliament in his place in a vote of 79 to 12, partially on a platform of nationalization of Iranian national resources, including the oil industry. Mossadegh indicated that he believed the Shah's role in the government should be, quote, to reign but not rule. Mossadegh gave a speech in 1951 where he said, quote, our long years of negotiation with foreign countries have yielded no results thus far. With the oil revenues, we could meet our entire budget and combat poverty, disease, and backwardness among our people. Another important consideration is that by the elimination of power of the British company, we would also eliminate corruption and intrigue, by means which the internal affairs of our country have been influenced. Once this tutelage has ceased, Iran will have achieved its economic and political independence. The Iranian state prefers to take over the production of petroleum itself. The company should do nothing else but return its property to the rightful owners. The nationalization law provides that 25% of the net profits on oil be set aside to meet the legitimate claims of the company for compensation. It has been asserted abroad that Iran intends to expel the foreign oil exports from the country and then shut down oil installations. Not only is this allegation absurd, it is utter invention. As negotiations broke down, the British functionally blockaded Iranian oil exports as it filed a complaint with the United Nations Security Council. In response, Mossadegh declared, quote, "The petroleum industry has contributed nothing to well-being of the people or to the technological progress or industrial development of my country." In 1952, Mossadegh attempted to increase the power of the parliament by asserting they should be able to appoint the Minister of War and Chief of Staff rather than the Shah. When the Shah refused, Mossadegh resigned in protest. When his replacement announced plans to resume negotiations with the British on oil, the National Front called for protests, with some even calling for the assassination of the Shah and his supporters. Mass protests and strikes occurred across the country in support of Mossadegh. On the fourth day of the protest, Ayatollah Khamenei, who had returned from exile, called for a holy war against the new prime minister. The Shah capitulated, and Mossadegh was returned to his role as prime minister, with the power to control the Ministry of War, which he demanded, as well as additional emergency powers. He appointed the Ayatollah Khamenei as the Speaker of the House, and severely restricted the powers and income of the Shah. By 1953, the British were able to convince the United States that Iran was at risk of falling to communist influence. When Dwight Eisenhower became president, the British and Americans agreed to work together to support a coup to remove Mossadegh. By this time, the oil embargoes were taking their toll on the Iranian economy, and Mossadegh and Ayatollah Khamenei's relationship had begun to sour. After an assassination attempt on Mossadegh and a cabinet member, Mossadegh jailed dozens of his political opponents, sparking protests. Mossadegh called for Parliament to be dissolved, so the Prime Minister be given the power to make laws submitted to the public for referendum. The vote was reported as a ludicrous 99% in support. When approached to be involved in the coup, reportedly the Shah initially opposed it, but he agreed to join after the vote when he was told by the CIA if he did not go along, he would also be removed. Most historians agree that President Eisenhower likely personally authorized Operation Ajax in order to remove Mossadegh. Operation Ajax planned to arrest Mossadegh and replace him with General Fazlullah Zahedi, while the Shah and his wife were out of town. But Mossadegh avoided arrest, and his supporters took to the streets in protest of the attempted coup, forcing the Shah to flee to Baghdad and General Zahedi to flee to a CIA safe house. Mossadegh then told his supporters to return home to life as usual, but this was premature. Anti-Mossadegh groups began taking to the streets after he issued a ban on demonstrations. While they were likely supported by the CIA and British intelligence, they also reflected a frustration at the economic conditions of the state brought on by the embargo. Major General Norman Schwarzkopf Sr. was able to help persuade the Shah to return to Iran. He also aided in training security forces who would come to be known as the Savak to help the Shah secure his hold on power. From a hotel room in Italy, the Shah reportedly watched coverage of the protests and declared, "I knew they loved me." In coordination with CIA officials, the Shah flew back to Tehran. Mossadegh was arrested and sentenced to death, a sentence the Shah would later commute. And as was the original plan of Project Ajax, General Zahedi officially replaced Mossadegh. The National Front was outlawed, martial law was put into effect, and parliamentary power was greatly limited, and Mohammad Reza Shah functionally became supreme leader of Iran. Martial law was technically lifted in 1957, but that same year, with the help of the United States, the Shah's secret police, the Savak, brutally repressed any opposition to the regime, often utilizing torture and murder. The Shah gave Iranian oil rights to a consortium of foreign oil companies, ostensibly splitting the profits with Iran, but no Iranians were allowed to be on the board or to be part of audits of the accounting. In 1963, demonstrations broke out when the Ayatollah Khomeini was arrested for speaking out against the Shah. While the protest led to his release, he was rearrested in 1964 and sent into exile in Iraq. During the 1970s, unlike other states in the Middle East, Iran was largely able to stay out of the conflict alleged to the oil embargo crisis, and greatly profited from the increased oil prices. But the wealth obtained tended to stay at the top, expanding the wealth gap and leading to resentment. Specifically, the Shah's family personally profited, collecting billions of dollars in oil revenue from the crisis. Meanwhile, inflationary pressures fell heavily on the rest of the country, and austerity proposals made to combat inflation only increased resentment of the regime. When the oldest son of the Ayatollah Khomeini died under mysterious circumstances, many blamed the Savak, and his funeral became a rallying point for those opposed to the Shah. Throughout the 70s, the Shah's health was also beginning to decline. He reportedly met with doctors following concerns about a swollen abdomen in 1974, and at that time, he was diagnosed with chronic lymphoid leukemia. This diagnosis was not only hidden from the public at the time, but reportedly from the Shah himself until 1978, when his health had declined to the point that he no longer appeared in public. Protests began to occur more frequently, but were brutally repressed by security forces. On January 8, 1978, seminary students marching in the city of Qom were fired on by security forces, leading to a number of deaths. According to Shia custom, memorial services are held 40 days after a person's death. The Ayatollah Khomeini called for commemorations of these deaths, declaring the blood of martyrs must water the, quote, tree of Islam. Large-scale protests broke out, emanating from the mosques, again leading to brutal crackdowns. 40 days later, the process repeated for those killed in the next series of protests and crackdowns, a cycle that continued on into the summer. On August 19th, arsonists barred the door to a movie theater and set it on fire, killing 422 people trapped inside. The Savak were widely blamed, likely incorrectly, but this increased anger toward the regime. On September 4th, an open-air prayer had brought between 200,000 and 500,000 out in Tehran to celebrate Eid, the end of the Ramadan feast. This turned into a protest march led by the clergy. A few days later, more protests occurred, leading to martial law being declared at midnight on September 8th. Around 6,000 protesters defied the order and were fired on by police, leading to dozens of deaths. And clashes continued throughout the day, leading to even more deaths. National strikes were called in September and October, egged on by Ayatollah Khomeini from exile. On November 5th, riots broke out in Tehran, where buildings associated with the West, such as movie theaters, department stores, and even the British embassy, were vandalized and set on fire. The following day, the Shah appointed a military government to replace parliament to regain control of the situation, but protests continued. On December 2nd, over 2 million protesters took to the streets. As the protests grew, an estimated 10% of the total population participated in marches. On January 16, 1979, the Shah was forced to flee the country. A member of the abolished National Front became prime minister and ordered Savak dissolved and political prisoners freed. The Ayatollah Khomeini was allowed to return from exile. But as the Ayatollah Khomeini returned, he rejected the new leader, stating on the day of his return, quote, "I shall kick their teeth in. I appoint the government. I appoint the government in support of this nation." He declared a separate government with a separate ruler, stating, quote, "Through the guardianship that I have from the holy lawgiver, I hereby pronounce Bazargan as the ruler, and I since have appointed him, he must be obeyed. The nation must obey him. This is not an ordinary government. It is a government based on the Sharia. Opposing this government means opposing the Sharia of Islam. Revolt against God's government is a revolt against God. Revolt against God is blasphemy." The new Prime Minister Bakhtar rejected this, stating, quote, "Iran has one government. More than this is intolerable, either for me or for you or for any other Iranian. As a Muslim, I had not heard that jihad refers to one Muslim against other Muslims. I will not give permission to the Ayatollah Khomeini to form an interim government. In life, there comes a time one must stand firm and say no. I have never seen a book about an Islamic republic. Neither has anyone else for that matter. Some of the people surrounding the Ayatollah are like violent vultures. The clergy should go to calm and build a wall around themselves and create their own Vatican." But Bakhtar had far less support than Khomeini. As protests continued, the army began to refuse to act. Even as Khomeini's rebels attacked police stations, military bases, and even weapons factories, where reportedly they acquired 50,000 machine guns, which were distributed to their supporters. On February 11, 1979, the Supreme Military Council declared itself, quote, "neutral in the current political disputes," in order to prevent further disorder and bloodshed. Without the support of the military, Bakhtar was forced to flee the country, as the Islamic revolutionaries took control of the government buildings, as well as TV and radio stations. Over the next year, Khomeini consolidated power and put down opposition movements, including an attempted Kurdish uprising, where reportedly hundreds of Kurdish villages were destroyed and at least 1,200 political prisoners executed. Khomeini was not in favor of democratic reforms, reportedly saying, quote, "Do not use this term democratic. That is the Western style." Over the summer of 1979, the new constitution made Khomeini the supreme leader. Khomeini shut down newspapers, and when this action was protested, his supporters attacked the protesters. He condemned the protesters as, quote, "wild animals. We will not tolerate them anymore. After each revolution, several thousands of these corrupt elements are executed in public and burnt, and the story is over. They are not allowed to publish newspapers." He issued warrants for arrests for his political rivals. In October of 1979, the exiled Shah flew to the United States for treatment for his leukemia. The Iranian leadership was able to use this event as a rallying cry. The special treatment the Shah was receiving from the West reminded Iranians of how, 26 years before, the Shah had fled to facilitate a CIA coup. Protesters demanded the Shah be sent back to Iran for trial, and Islamic pro-Khomeini students stormed the U.S. Embassy and took the staff hostage. While not directly planned, Khomeini saw an opportunity. He reportedly said of the hostage crisis, quote, "This action has many benefits. This has united our people. Our opponents do not dare act against us. We can put the constitution to the people's vote without difficulty and carry out presidential and parliamentary elections." Documents released in the embassy showed many more moderate figures in Iranian politics opposed to Khomeini who were meeting with U.S. officials, further radicalizing the revolution. And when a sandstorm interfered with the U.S. rescue operation, many saw it as a sign of divine intervention in support of Khomeini. When Iraq invaded to take oil fields in 1980, many rallied around the government against the invaders, and repression of opposition groups as part of the wartime response were viewed as necessary and widely accepted. Even groups which recently allied with Khomeini could quickly find themselves as outsiders. Billions of dollars in financial and logistical support for Iraqi Ba'athists led by Saddam Hussein only reinforced Iranian hatred of the West, and America specifically, particularly as the war became more brutal with the use of chemical weapons by Iraq, particularly against the Kurdish people in both Iraq and Iran. Covertly, through the Iran-Contra affair, the Reagan administration was also sending arms to Iran, functionally meaning they were arming both sides of the war. Universities, the source of many of the early revolutionaries, were closed for 2 years to purge them of opposition, with tens of thousands of teachers and military officers dismissed as being, quote, westernized. By 1982, the war continued, but Iraq had been pushed back to their original borders. The MEK party, which had previously been allied with Khomeini, were targeted for a purge in which thousands of members were executed. The MEK retaliated with bombings against Islamic leaders, all in the midst of the war with Iraq, but by 1983, most opposition within Iran had been crushed. Some members of rival parties were forced to confess on national television to their transgressions. In July of 1988, just before the end of the Iran-Iraq War, Khomeini ordered the execution of thousands of political prisoners over a period of 5 months, often under torture. His order read, quote, "In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, as the treacherous hypocrites do not believe in Islam, and what they say is out of deception and hypocrisy, and as their leaders have confessed that they have become renegades, and as they are waging war on God, and as they are engaging in classical warfare in the western, the northern, and southern fronts, and as they are collaborating with the Ba'ath Party of Iraq and spying for Saddam against our Muslim nation, and as they are tied to the world arrogance, and in light of their cowardly blows to the Islamic Republic since its inception, it is decreed that those who are in prison throughout the country and remain steadfast in their support for the hypocrites are waging war on God and are condemned to execution." Victims' families were not allowed to hold funerals for a year, despite Islamic custom, but if they complied, they would be told where their loved ones were buried. On June 3, 1989, Khomeini died after suffering 5 heart attacks in 10 days. So many warders had come that a planned funeral procession was canceled as there was no room in the streets, and instead the body was taken by helicopter to the cemetery. At the cemetery, so many mourners attended that authorities lost control. A New York Times reporter wrote, quote, "The crowd, much of it made up of Revolutionary Guards detailed to maintain order, pulled the coffin from the helicopter and began parading around the makeshift compound surrounding the gravesite. As the excitement grew, the body of the Ayatollah, wrapped in a white burial shroud, fell out of the flimsy wooden coffin, and in a mad scene, people in the crowd reached to touch the shroud. The soldiers pushed and wrestled, finally firing war shots to get the body back. Ayatollah Khomeini's son, Ahmed, was knocked from his feet, but even as the soldiers pushed the body back into the helicopter, the crowd swarmed over the craft, dragging it back down as it tried to take off. Others jumped into the hole dug for Ayatollah's body. The troops drove the crowd back, finally clearing the compound enough to allow the helicopter to take off, its rotors scattering more mourners. Years before his death, Khomeini had selected a former student of his to succeed him. This student was known as the Grand Ayatollah Hussein Ali Montazeri. His selection was approved by an assembly of experts in 1985. But when a man Montazeri had known since childhood was executed in 1987, he wrote to Khomeini, quote, "Your prisons are far worse than those of the Shah and the Savak." This letter was leaked in March of 1989, which led Khomeini to change his selection. Instead, he selected the then president of Iran, Ali Khamenei. Khamenei had risen to the presidency after Iranian dissidents attempted to assassinate him in 1981, causing him to lose the use of his right arm. In his inaugural address in 1981, he vowed to eliminate, quote, "deviation, liberalism, and American-influenced leftists." Khamenei remained in power until he was killed by U.S. and Israeli forces in 2026. History is awkward.